Did anyone call for a Priester? The Pirates did just that when they called up their top pitching prospect, Quinn Priester, to start the series opener against the Guardians. Andy Rodriguez, Leo Figueroa, Nick Gonzalez, Henry Davis. Compare these Pittsburgh promotions of organizational stars with the armada of young stars landing further down the Ohio in Cincinnati. You can only come to one conclusion. We are seeing the future of the NL Central unfold right before our eyes. So let's open the files of Central Intelligence and investigate more closely. You've been recruited to join forces and learn more about the top news and stories from the NL Central right here on Central Intelligence, a Slasher Sports baseball podcast presented by Slasher Sports and always available on our YouTube channel and our Spotify podcast feed. I am Special Agent in charge of National League Central Affairs, Steve Eck, and your host. Follow the podcast on Twitter at Slasher Baseball. Share your comments and show suggestions via email, slashersports@yahoo.com. And be sure to join the growing Slasher Sports community on Discord. This way we can keep the conversations going all week, every week. We're here every week, usually on a Thursday. Sometimes we might mix it up depending on what's going on. Maybe when we head into the trading deadline, we might take a look at maybe doing a show or doing a podcast actually on trade deadline night and see how things are shaping up for NL Central teams. But before we make those kind of changes, you can do even more spying by visiting slashersports.com. Check out our baseball, our collegiate sports, our cinema and lifestyle content. You can even go shopping in our Redbubble shop. So the clock is ticking as far as the second half beginning, and certainly towards the trade deadline. There'll be lots of subplots and interesting stories coming out of the National League Central in those days leading up to the trade deadline. Certainly, you've got a mixture of buyers and sellers. I would say there's two buyers. It's going to be the Brewers and, of course, the Cincinnati Reds. And the sellers, I think the Cubs have gotten to that point where they've decided that they need to shop around their better aspects. We're going to talk about one of those trade chips, if you will, here in a little bit when we do our background checks. And, of course, the Cardinals, they're done. Fork's still sticking out of them. And the Pirates, I think they're going to sell off the remaining veterans they have on the club. Not necessarily all of them. I'm sure they can get a decent return for Carlos Santana and for Rich Hill. I don't think they're going to trade David Bednar, but a lot of stuff coming up there. So make sure you tune back every week here at Central Intelligence, and we'll open up the file, see what's going on. Time for our background checks for this week here in July. And I think it only fitting that we start with the Milwaukee Brewers. Standing O for the Milwaukee Brewers. They entered back-to-back three-game series with the division-leading Cincinnati Reds and emerged after the past weekend sweep at Great American Ballpark with a two-game lead. And as we record that, it's actually expanded to 2.5 games. They took care of business at home, winning 2 of 3. And they put on an exclamation point on their lead and in these head-to-head battles with the Reds by showing off the type of pitching, especially starting pitching, that many people, myself included, point to as the difference maker in the NL Central race. Now, Corbin Burnes was masterful this past Friday night. He battled the heat. It was kind of a nerve-wracking moment, I think, not only for Brewer fans, but for baseball fans to see him kind of go down to one knee, given that there have been people having heat issues and having serious health issues, with their heart and various things when the heat happens. But he battled that heat. He fired up 13 strikeouts over 102 pitches, only allowed 2 hits across his 6 innings. The young Reds lineup, they never were allowed to feel comfortable when Burnes was on the mound, and they sure kind of breathes a sign of relief, I would think. But they just couldn't get anything done against the Brewers on Friday. On Saturday, you had Freddie Peralta. And he may have been even better in different ways. I mean, Corbin Burnes is an ace, and he's going to go out there and get 10 plus strikeout kind of outings. Freddie Peralta is not necessarily that kind of pitcher, but he kept the Reds lineup off balance. He struck out 6 over 6 innings. 4 Milwaukee relievers combined for a 1-hit shutout. That's right. Only 1 hit the Reds managed in that game on Saturday. And when you have an exciting never say die, never say stop lineup like the Reds have, the soft underbelly of the beast is an uber aggressiveness at each at bat for the Reds. Burns and Peralta are veteran arms who have a plan every time they go out on the mound, take the ball. I'm not saying that the plan works every single time. It would kind of take the fun out of playing baseball if everybody was perfect every single time. But they know what they want to do. And it's not the youth per se of Cincinnati that caused this series sweep, but it is the natural aggressiveness, whooper aggressiveness, really, in that lineup that I think, I just think other National League contenders are going to take note of that and try to exploit that, as the season goes on. A lot of times, the Reds look lost. De La Cruz has been on a bit of a tailspin, and considering what he put up prior to the slump, I mean, you don't want to give him any crap for it. And again, he's going to come out of it. The Reds are going to, kind of reload and reform their. Let's start that from there again. The Reds are going to reload, reformulate what they want to do, but they're not going to stop being aggressive. Just because they were stymied by a Milwaukee pitching staff in that series, I don't think that you're going to see the Reds change what has been so successful for them. Now, the third game of the series, I think that's really where Milwaukee has an advantage over a lot of teams in the NL, not just the Cincinnati Reds. As it was when Josh Hader was a Brewer in closing for Milwaukee, it may be more so with Devin Williams as the closer in Milwaukee. The Brewers go into the 9th inning with a lead. 98.6% of the time, they're going to win the game. It ain't over, folks. Okay, the Brewers didn't win the NL Central with the 6 games over the last 10 days or so with the Reds. And even the Brewers are going to tell you that. But it's a nice confidence boost going into the second half. And by the way, let me finish the thought about going into the second half with a big series win. Then I want to talk about how hard is it really for Major League Baseball to have the All-Star game and All-Star festivities exactly on the 81st game, or give or take a game or two. Is it really that hard to figure out and to calculate and to make happen? And if you're going to have a first half and a second half, then the halves should be equal. Okay, it can't possibly be that difficult. So going forward there, Rob Manfred and MLB front offices and MLBPA, let's have a true first half and a true second half. Okay, let me get down off of my soapbox here and get back to the Brewers. And I want to give a really quick draft update. Now, they did sign their first round pick, Brock Wilken, at almost $1 million below pick slot value, $3.15 million bonus for the slugging third baseman out of Wake Forest. 5 of the Brewers' 21 picks have come to terms. And most notably, all 5 are among the team's first 6 picks. Only a high school shortstop, Eric Bitante, I think he was their 3rd round pick, has not signed yet. It's still early, especially if you're starting to draft high school players, what the Brewers did later in the draft. I mean, they always kind of go for a college bat. I think they've done that 4 years in a row now. They want to have as many players and many bullets in the holster, if you will, sooner and then give these younger players time to develop. But I mean, I think the Brewers are pretty much right on schedule. I mean, a lot of the high school players aren't going to sign. They're going to choose to go to college, try to improve their draft stock. And that happens with every team every year. So I wouldn't be nervous if I was a Brewers fan that they've only signed, 5 of their picks. But the fact is, 5 of those 6 picks were in the early rounds. And I think that's a lot more important that the Brewers, that the players that are rated higher, that graded out on their boards, they've all signed early and are going to get an earlier jump start on their pro careers. And we'll see what happens with the high school players, how many of them they can bring on board. Now, for the sake of our podcast here, I'm going to package discussions of the Chicago Cubs and the St. Louis Cardinals. And I'm doing that because I want us to think about, to ponder, to wonder. And that's really what this podcast is about. My goal is to get you to think, not to get you to agree with me. I want you to think about the things that we discuss here on Central Intelligence and formulate your own opinions, but I want you to think. First and foremost, I want you to think for yourselves. I don't want you to march lock, stock, and barrel behind everything that I say. If you do that, personally, I would probably want to give you a 1-800 number so you can call for mental health. I don't want everybody, just jumping on board with what I'm doing here. But I do want you to think about it. Take pause and think about it and say, Feck really does say some really, outside the box, out of left field type of things. But I see where he's coming from. I kind of get it. I don't agree, but I kind of get it. That's really the vibe. And that's what I want everybody that listens to this podcast to do. But anyway, there's an interesting what if. And it involves the Cubs and the Cardinals. And you need to follow me on this, because on first blush, you're going to say, oh, come on, that'll never happen. But I just want you to follow me here. St. Louis's GM, John Mozeliak, told reporters this week that the Cardinals' approach to the trade deadline was, and I paraphrase kind of, pitching, and more pitching. And when you review the box scores and game results, which are the actual analytics baseball fans need to pay attention to, analytics gurus are the 21st century version of fantasy sports vultures of the 1990s. They're trying to sell you a bill of goods, but ultimately you win, you lose, you score runs, you don't score runs, you pitch well, you don't pitch well, whatever scenario you want to put it in. That's all right there in a box score. It's obvious when you look at box scores and you carry that over extrapolated over the course of the 2023 season so far, that the Cardinals need to address the most obvious and urgent need that they have, and that is starting pitching. Actually, pitching in general. They need bullpen help as well. I know Jordan Hicks has kind of figured it out to a degree. I don't know if I want to use figured it out. He's pitched well. If Jordan Hicks ever figures it out, look out National League. Not just NL Central. Look out National League. But they need to bring in fresh arms. And they have the bats that they can flip, pardon the pun, for said pitching. And as much as it may hurt some fans, and they're going to lose their favorite underperformers or just their favorite players in general, you got to give up to get. The Cardinals could set the market now that the front office has admitted their failures constructing this existing roster. I mean, Mozeliak has finally come out and said, okay, we screwed this up. He didn't use those words, but I mean, in essence, reading between the lines, he knows, boy, we really screwed this up. And we sort of saw it coming last year to a degree, but it's really presented itself as not a Titanic sinking, but there's water coming in, through the hole here. They need to get this corrected. So having said that, enter the Chicago Cubs. who I believe are moving closer to the decision that they will need to sell some assets to recoup some future pieces. They're not a radical tear down like the Cardinals will have to go through. And I don't think the Cardinals or the Cubs are going to go into a rebuild. I think they're going to have to retool it just a little bit. The Cubs are much closer than the Cardinals at this point to being able to be a divisional contender. But with the right moves, both teams could be right back, in the favorites conversations that everybody has in the offseason. And I think it's good. I mean, for the National League Central and for the National League in general, it's good for the Cardinals to be competitive and to be good. When the Cardinals have years like this, it takes a little air out of the balloon, if you will. So, Cubs are there. They're very close to being seriously relevant again. They kind of took 3 years off to kind of reimagine themselves, and that's why they brought David Ross in, so it's more of a steadying, calming voice as these young players kind of gain their legs and gain their balance and learn how to become major league players, and more importantly, major league contributors. The number one impact player at this trade deadline is Marcus Stroman. Now, before you start sending me nasty emails or comments on our YouTube channel or on the podcast feed, Shohei Ohtani is the wildest of wild cards. I personally cannot fathom Artie Moreno giving the green light to Perry Manassian to pull a trigger on an Ohtani deal. Baseball fans, especially fans of the NL Central teams, should focus on Marcus Stroman. Is he staying? Is he going? What is the scoop? And my guess is Jed Hoyer sees a golden goose that he can cook here by bringing in multiple pieces that are either already major league ready or very close to being major league ready, and maybe even add some depth in the lower levels of their minor leagues in return for the NL's best pitcher this season. So why not seriously impact pennant races by trading Marcus Stroman to the hated St. Louis Cardinals? I mean, think about it. The Cardinals may need to overpay and overcorrect their pitching woes. And the one thing the Cardinals have done since the 1930s right on up to the current day with Arenado and Goldschmidt is they sell star power to their fan base. There are always premier players on the Cardinals roster, even in slim times, even when things aren't going quite so well. Stan Musial didn't always play on great Cardinal teams in the 50s and early 60s. The guy who could become a fan favorite for years to come under the arches can be Marcus Stroman. Outspokenness and whatever black marks that might be on him and all, Marcus Stroman could be that pitching star in St. Louis. The Cubs are perhaps a consistent producer away from being considered an NL Central favorite next year. I believe that there's two other teams that have a say in that, but for the sake of this what-if scenario, they are a consistent bat away. If they can tap into the Cardinals' surplus of certainly outfielders, but positional players. And if you look at the Cardinals draft, they drafted a whole bunch more outfielders. I mean, basically, they're bringing bats in to continually develop them, and perhaps their long-term plan is to actually use them as trade chips down the road, to help supplement rosters that might be contending. They're not going to be contenders this year. If you can throw in a few prospect chips and a Stroman to go to St. Louis, this deal could very well be a push. in the aggregate, in the big picture, you get a big bat, a bat that perhaps needs a change of scenery. Not Tyler O'Neill per se, but a Dylan Carlson. I mean, an Alec Burleson. I think they would maybe succeed, certainly Wrigley Field. Most home games, Wrigley Field is a hitter's paradise as opposed to a pitcher's park. And the extra little twist of the knife, if you will, for Jed Hoyer and the Cubs and for Cub fans is that if St. Louis can't lock up Stroman long term, then it's almost a win-win situation for the Cubs. They can start to fade that dark stain of the Lou Brock for Ernie Broglio trade from the early 60s once and for all. Just get an exorcist, get it out. If the Cardinals then could not retain Stroman and you gain valuable pieces that are going to now let you beat the Cardinals, seek a little bit of revenge, a guy that going from the Cardinals to the Cubs. And it's not like, the old days anymore where the rivalry is not between the lines on the field in the opposing dugouts. The rivalry is in the stands among the fans. It's sports radio fodder. It's podcast discussion, if you will. Contreras and Hayward are just some of the big names that over the last decade or so that have swapped uniforms for either a Cubs for a Cardinal or Cardinal for a Cub, and what really drives me crazy, the way that players like slurp their opponents and their friends in the opposing dugouts anymore. Batting practice, pregame get-togethers. It's, all that slurping erases any possible blood rivalry, anymore. It's a different game. It's not like it was when I was a kid. Or maybe when your parents or your grandparents were kids. It's not that game anymore. And I accept that. But I don't want to hear about, you can't do that, can't trade a guy to a rival. I think that you get the best deal at all times. Doesn't matter who the trade partner is. Is it harder for the Cubs and Cardinals to trade? Maybe. Red Sox, Yankees, yeah, maybe. You've got all these teams, Rangers, Astros. You can go down the list of rivalries. Yeah, probably is. But if you're truly going to make your team better, you can't be afraid of that. And you need to just make the deal. So just kind of let that fester for a while. Stroman to the Cardinals. And its big impact is it now keeps Marcus Stroman away from other NL contenders, let's say. And so you're impacting the trade market in a different and a more subtle way. I think that would be really intriguing to do. As for the draft, so let's look at the Cubs first. They did sign their top pick, Matt Shaw, to a slot value deal, exactly $4.84 million signing bonus. They banked 8 of their 20 picks so far. Once again, primarily college players and normal for high school players drafted lower to try to college rather than sign for lower slot bonuses. And as for the Cardinals, they have signed their number 1 pick, outfielder Chase Davis out of Arizona. And as we talked last week in this podcast, I think very highly of Chase Davis. He will be the best of the batch of young Cardinal outfielders and the best of the batch of NL Central number 1 draft picks out of this draft when careers totals get tabulated. I'll be sure to wear my Chase Davis Hall of Famer t-shirt. I'll get one made up here over the next couple of weeks and wear that on Central Intelligence. But, they have Chase Davis inked. Mozeliak has already locked up the majority of his draft class, including multiple college arms that may see the majors within 2-3 seasons tops. So that also helps play into what he wants to do here at the deadline and get immediate pitching help and help they're going to be able to carry through for years to come. I don't know if Mikolas is going to be around next year. He may be moved at the deadline. Wainwright's going to retire. There's a changing of the guard, in the Cardinals pitching staff. So why not get that started there? And Mozeliak, I thought he had a great draft. I thought he had a really, really great draft. I forget my fanboying over Chase Davis. Thought he had a great draft. But you got to wonder, is he going to be around to see these players come and develop and really be contributors in St. Louis Cardinals uniforms? You have to wonder that. I'm also going to bundle the Pirates and the Reds as well. And as I teased, in the open, from a more concrete point of view, Pittsburgh has been unlocking the door for their most prized major league ready prospects, not necessarily their best prospects, but for the most part with Pittsburgh, we're now seeing their best prospects in the system. There are a couple of guys they've drafted over the last year or two that are still developing. But, you've got, Henry Davis and Gonzalez, high first round picks. Quinn Priester, he had a good start for 3 innings, and then the Guardians offense kind of came to life, and it was his first start. First starts don't always go very well, but I thought overall he availed himself pretty well. But these players that we're watching now on the Pirates, they're not necessarily here to get the Pirates back in the NL Central race or even to get to 500. If they end up with 90 losses, that's a 10-game improvement. I think they're going to be closer to maybe 75 and 87 or whatever. But still, if they're in that ballpark, Ben Cherington and his staff has to be really, really happy. It's hard to tell a Pirate fan, and I live in Pittsburgh. Okay, I get it. Okay, I understand why you're still very cynical. But we're looking at young players staking their claims to major league jobs in 2024. And it's going to be fun, and I think it's important for baseball fans in general, but certainly fans of the NL Central, to follow what's going to be going on here. Okay, a lot of their young players that led to that 20-8 run that they had early, they're going to be role players on future contending teams. So, and we saw some of that, with Castro and Marcano and other young players that were up, but through an eye-patched view, if you will, of the planned influx of prospects that the Pirate fans have been hearing since Cherington imploded the Pirates roster in 2020. He has taken on an expansion team approach, as we've discussed in previous Central Intelligence episodes, to bring the Buccos back to the playoffs. And, and the reactions are varying from a hopeful enthusiasm to wanting to see Cherington and owner Bob Nutting walk the plank. Now, okay, I get it, Pirate fans. Bob Nutting is a dope. He's a dope with his newspaper empires, in his real estate holdings. He is stupid on so many levels with a capital stew. But he hired the right guys when he brought in Cherington and Williams, who handles the business side of it all, if you're not following up on front office type of things. All of those names that a couple of years ago were merely bits of type in the seemingly endless parade of trade stories are now being sketched on the back of Pirate uniforms. Pirate fans need to push the bile and the bad taste from years past down. Okay, you need to swallow that. You need to allow yourself to enjoy seeing these guys. Henry Davis, Quinn Priester, Andy Rodriguez. Watch these guys join the ranks of major league impact players. Now, the impact is going to vary by degree, but you're mixing them in with the Mitch Kellers and Johan Oviedo. O'Neill Cruz is going to be back ideally before the end of the year. He's a special talent. Your veteran core, Brian Reynolds, Brian Hayes, they're locked up. Allow yourself to enjoy this. I'm not saying that you're going to like the results night in, night out through the rest of the season. I know you want it to be the 20-8 Pirates from April and not the team that's struggling out of the gate here in the second half of the season. Allow yourself to enjoy it. I bundled them with the Reds because they're following similar paths. Now, the Reds are at least a full season ahead of the Pirates. Nick Kroll, I think, focused a lot on college arms, college bats. He assumed a lot of good young lower level talent that they've done an amazing job developing. And honestly, there needs to be a book written about the Cincinnati Reds team, and not just Elly De La Cruz. Isn't he fun? It needs to be written about the Matt McLeans and the Spencer Steers, and just the approach and the development skills that were applied by Nick Kroll's front office to get this uber exciting team on the field and playing winning baseball. The recent slides and struggles notwithstanding, this is a winning team in 2023, the Cincinnati Reds. And we've talked a lot about the Reds turnaround so far this season. And we're going to be talking about De La Cruz and McLean and Spear and India and Abbott and Friedel for years. They just called up Christian Encarnacion Strand, who naturally, of course, as the Red season is going, hit a pinch hit home run for his first hit, in the major leagues. I wonder if it's a showcase, though. I would imagine that of all their prospects, as far as a team looking for somebody that could really step into a job and contribute in a stretch, even if it's a contender, I think Christian Encarnacion Strand is the guy the Reds could move in a big deal for a frontline starter that wouldn't have as negative an impact as if you tried to move some of the other guys. I mean, Nick Senzel will probably be shopped, I would think. But the Reds have already shown us that this is a team to be reckoned with, a team that you need to recognize they're not going away anytime soon. As much as I have reservations about David Bell being the guy to bring the Reds to the promised land, again, still, you can't argue with the results. The days of the Cardinals and the Cubs and the Brewers taking turns winning NL Central titles without much resistance, they're over. The new rising stars that are playing in Great American Ballpark and PNC Park, those River City players, they're on the rise. The Rivers are rising here in the NL. And it's why the NL Central is the most intriguing division to follow year in and year out. We all know that. All of us here on Central Intelligence, all of the listeners and the people behind the scenes here, we all know how great this division is. It's time for MLB and some of the writers to kind of catch up on that. Now, to review the Pirates draft really quick, the Pirates signed their 1-1 wonder kid, Paul Skeens, this week. He signed about $500,000 below projected bonus value, but he still signed for the highest bonus ever given an MLB draftee. He bumped Spencer Torkelson of the Tigers off the top of the list. $9.2 million. Jumping Jesus on a pogo stick. Being in Pittsburgh as this is all going on, this is where some of the positive speak is happening. They have a true franchise pitcher probably for the first time since Doug Drabek, if Skeens is as good as all the scouts and all the pundits seem to think that he is. And sorry, sticky fingers, Garrett Cole. Doug Drabek was the last real franchise pitcher here in Pittsburgh. Added to that, Cherington signed 12 of his 20 picks already, predominantly college players. But again, Cherington likes to bring in college players because you can start working them into the major leagues, filling in for injuries, filling in specific roles earlier than you can going the high school route. And I think the Pirates did a horrible job going for high school talent under Neil Huntington, and the Pirate fans paid the price of it going there. But there's very promising signs for the future. Over in Cincy, they signed their top pick, Rhett Lauder, on July 14th. about 600,000 under slot value, but don't cry for Brett. He'll be seeking out tax shelters after agreeing to a $5.7 million bonus. And as time has passed since the draft, I love this pick a little bit more each day. I think with a few minor league polishing of the gem appearances, I really think Louder could, not will, but could come up before September 1st and be a contributor down the stretch for the Reds. I mean, I don't think it's that far-fetched. His floor is very high. His ceiling is not so much above that floor. So he is what he is. He is that polished gemstone. I think bring him up, give him a chance. Worst comes to worst, he struggles a little bit. You let him sit and learn, watching what's going on. In a pennant race, being around a team, a young, exciting team in a pennant race. The Reds have signed 15 of their draft selections already. The hits and the strikes keep coming for the Reds. So it's not a done deal yet. Okay, it's something that we are seeing the future unfold before our eyes. We just have to be patient with the Reds having slumps and the Pirates' young players struggling and not quite putting it all together right away. We have to accept the struggles and the bad with the good. There's going to be a lot of good in Pittsburgh and Cincinnati. And the Cardinals aren't going to just be the Cardinals of 2023 forever. I mean, their fans aren't going to stand for it, but they're not going to just be a sub 500 team for the next couple of years. They're not going to rebuild. The Cubs are coming out of a pretty major rebuild, and with the right moves at the deadline, as we talked about Marcus Stroman, not necessarily to the Cardinals. That was more of a fun exercise, but the Cubs are going to come up, and the Brewers are the Brewers. The Brewers, in a lot of ways, are the Tampa Bay Rays of the National League. They just find these hidden beauties, if you will, and turn them into productive major league players. So the NL Central is going to be a lot of fun, and hopefully you'll keep following it here, not only this year, but into the future at Slasher Sports. Well, we've had a lot of serious discussion here, so let's tell a bedtime story. We did a bedtime story about Wrigley Field and how it wasn't built for the Cubs. It was built for a Federal League franchise. So this time, let's talk about the history or the story or histrionics, if you will, of the NL Central. And it was created in 1994 to accommodate the brand new wild card concept in Major League Baseball. But riddle me this, Batman. Why wouldn't Major League Baseball just divide into 3 divisions in 1993 when they actually expanded? I don't understand the logic to that. Never did. I know there was a lot of building contention, with the Players Association. Then we had the devastating season-ending strike in '94 that was spilled over into '95. So I'm sure I'm sure this came up. I don't remember it being a stickler issue, adding the playoff spot. And everybody was tug of warring back and forth, but I don't think it was a big deal about the wild card spot as far as the players' dissatisfaction. But they put the NL Central together. They brought over the Astros. They played in the Central Time Zone. Okay, that made sense. Took them out of the NL West, so that benefited the 5th largest TV market in the U.S., Houston, a little bit as far as their start times go. You had St. Louis and Chicago where it never really made sense that they were in the NL East. Like, why was Atlanta and Cincinnati in the AL West? The NL West rather, and you had St. Louis in the NL East. It didn't make any sense. So now you had a more geographical alignment. You kept the rivalry intact, and then you had the Pittsburgh Pirates. The Pirates were supposed to be and remain in the NL East. And then Uncle Teddy Turner and his now very powerful TBS Superstation played a major role in the Braves being moved to the East from the NL West and the Pirates being placed in the Central. Now, on the surface, Ted Turner and the Braves organization was saying, well, we want to develop a natural rivalry with the expansion Florida Marlins. Southeast, okay. There was a lot of talk about how much would the Marlins impact, the Superstation and impact the Braves fandom. But I don't think it changed much. I mean, Florida is still a Atlanta Braves territory, except in and around Tampa Bay and down in Miami. But that was the cover story there. Wayne Huizenga of the Marlins in a meeting said, "Well, no, we'll move to the NL Central. I'm not so worried about having, an Eastern time start of 7:05 every night. I don't mind being 8:00 games. I mean, Miami was the kind of market that I think everybody knew when you got home at night, maybe you turned the game on for a couple of innings. I mean, you weren't really building your day when you've got, South Beach and all these wonderful places, all these great the weather is amazing, all these outdoor activities. You're not building your day or your night around the Florida Marlins baseball game, even in the beginning. I think I understood that. But he did want that rivalry with the Braves. So that was kind of exposed when the Marlins owner said, well, we don't mind being in the NL Central. But in essence, I mean, the Pirates ownership at the time, it was a consortium, really. It was the city of Pittsburgh itself had a large stake in it. And you had U.S. Steel and Alcoa. You had PNC Bank. You had Mellon Bank. I know I'm leaving people out there, but all the major PPG, all the major players in Pittsburgh's economy all had a stake ownership in the Pirates. They were more concerned about seats in the fannies in the stands and generating gate revenues, or I'm trying to improve gate revenues. They didn't really care whether they were in the NL East as far as the owners go, but certainly for the fans, it was a big blow for the Pirates fans to accept that they were now in the NL Central. Now they were able to carry over that rivalry with the Reds, which had started to heat up in the late 60s when both teams weren't quite, where they would become yet. But by 1970, both teams were powerhouses in the National League. And they were always in the conversation as to who's going to win the NL pennant. All through the 70s. It slid a little bit in the 80s, built back up in the early 90s. So there was that long-term rivalry there with the Reds. But you don't think the Pirates would rather play the Phillies and the Mets, where they had really developed really heated rivalries, when the Pirates had that big resurgence under Jim Leyland from like 86 to 92? So again, it was a money grab. And Ted Turner and TBS, the Superstation, had the muscle that they could flex their way into the NL East, and the Pirates were moved to the NL Central. Then come 1998, you add the Milwaukee Brewers. In order to have a quote-unquote balanced schedule, you didn't have the extensive interleague play you have now. You needed an even number of teams in each league, or so they thought. Bud Selig had always wanted to be a National League owner. He grew up a Milwaukee Braves fan, so he always wanted to be an NL owner. Now he was. The Brewers agreed, for the sake of expansion, to move from the AL East, from the AL Central rather, over into the NL Central. And it was the only division with 6 teams for the longest time. Houston eventually moved out to the AL West, again under the premise of, well, we want to improve, the expanded wild card, and we're willing to move, to the Central. They wanted to have a natural heated rivalry with the Texas Rangers in the AL West. So the Astros moved to the AL West. The NL Central is pretty much remained, the same ever since. There's only one team that has never won an NL Central Division title. It's the Pittsburgh Pirates. And yes, there was that 20 some odd year stretch where they were just horrid. But if you think about it, I mean, they were a wild card a couple of years in a row. They just never won a division. The Cardinals by far have been the dominant force in the NL Central. So when we go back to earlier when we were talking about how things are changing, and it's essentially changing for the good, that's not a knock on what the Cardinals have meant to the NL Central. They've won 12 division titles. The next closest are the Cubs with 6. But it just shows you how long the Cardinals dominated this division. Maybe kind of took it for granted that they were in the NL Central, so they didn't necessarily have to put their pedal to the metal until the playoffs came around. Maybe benefited them making some long runs to the World Series. But ultimately, I mean, they are the dominant team. The Astros, before they moved out, they had 4 division titles. Reds and Brewers have each had 3. Considering the Brewers have been there a shorter time than anybody else in the division, I mean, that speaks a lot to what the Brewers are. So for those of you always kind of curious about, like, well, how do these divisional things flush out? How do they come to this? That's the story in a nutshell of the NL Central. I think we'll do another bedtime story down the road and get a little bit more in depth about the whole Ted Turner versus tiny Pittsburgh battle that Pittsburgh was never going to win, and how it sort of unfolded, and just a lot of hypocrisy behind saying, well, we want a natural rivalry between the Marlins and the Braves, so we're going to put the Braves in the East. Geographically, Atlanta is just to the west of Pittsburgh. Not much, just to the west. If you're driving down Interstate 79 from Western Pennsylvania, you're eventually going to have to veer a little bit west to get to metropolitan Atlanta. Just saying. I'm happy the Pirates are in the NL Central, but a little bit of a story behind all of that. We're going to wrap things up here for this week. Thanks again for tuning into Central Intelligence. Don't forget to join the Discord community for Slasher Sports. It's not just Slasher Sports. Slasher U, my partner Christian Rao, has some wonderful things set up for the college football season. Both FBS and FCS coverage will happen. We've got Billy Graves, who does a wonderful job interviewing the people that make independent horror films, and he has a wonderful knowledge of the history of these films, and he does a lot of good pieces on that as well. And then there's Suki Suburbia and the Honeydew Project. If you haven't checked it out, Honeydew, you need to check out the Honeydew Project on our YouTube channel. It is fantabulous. It really is. It is unique. And just because you're a sports fan, don't say, oh yeah, I'm telling you, you're going to learn something every single episode that you watch. So make sure you do that going forward. I am the NL agent in charge of National League Central Affairs, Steve Beck, and your host of Central Intelligence Podcast. We'll be back next Thursday with another episode. Until then, let's hope your NL Central team does something that makes us talk about it on the next episode of Central Intelligence.